A very good morning, afternoon, or evening to you, wherever you might be, and a warm welcome to the 7th edition of our show, The 3Ms, which we abbreviate to the 3Ms, the show in which we peel back the layers of misunderstanding and misinterpretation that lead to misinformation. My name is Ian Ingalls, and I shall be your host. Here I am, as usual, with my two fellow China expatriate experts, Jerry Gray and Fernando Munoz. Good morning, gents.
Good
Good
morning.
morning, Ian. Good morning, everybody.
Now, as usual, I pose questions to Jerry and Fernando on various topical and ongoing news stories about China, and they will give us their enlightened responses. In our previous shows, we have discussed the US Congress's Uyghur Policy Act, China's alleged social credit system, as well as China's impending collapse and the TikTok debacle. Do feel free to check them out on our channel. And I think it's important to note, as I do every show, that the three of us have all been living here in China for many decades, collectively around 65 years, and have had many different experiences of life and work in different parts of the country, which is something that many speculators, pontificators, and so-called China experts in the West cannot claim to have had. So, with that done, let's move on to the topic. Many Chinese friends particularly ask me what it is that the governments of some countries can see that others can't, which makes them so willing to follow the USA into endless wars, sanctions on their major trading partners, and into conflict where harmony either should exist or once existed. The US is currently the source of much of the misinformation on China, as we've already established in previous shows. After all, we don't really need to look far to find it. It's in our faces every time we open up a Western media outlet and read a story about China. Notice my choice of words, story and not article, as this is exactly what many of them are. So, Jerry, if I could bring you in, why is it that so many countries are prepared to follow the US path and place their own economies and, in many cases, their own militaries in harm's way?
That's a very good question, Ian. Well, the truth is, it isn't so many countries. And if we look at the history, we'll see that it never was. The USA is only 4% of the global population, but it is over 25% of the global GDP. At least it was in 2022. It seems to be declining now. If we look at the countries which do support the USA in almost every aspect, of course, there's Israel, Australia, and the UK. Then there are some who support the US in most of their endeavors, and they would be countries like New Zealand and India. But there are two other countries which will literally do whatever the USA asks them: South Korea and Japan. Now, these two places are occupied and have been for almost 80 years. Strangely, Germany too. And what do Germany and the Philippines have in common, if you think about that?
Is it that both these countries were occupied by the USA after World War II?
Yep, you've got it in one. That's absolutely spot on. And after they occupied Germany and Japan and went to war in Korea, the US pretty much had control of every aspect of those countries' intelligence, defense, communications, banking systems, utilities, all their infrastructure.
Well, that certainly sounds very shocking. Fernando, if I could just bring you in. Can they really control any and every aspect of life in those countries? Just how serious and far-reaching is it, Fernando?
Well, we should make no mistake about this. The US has already invaded and occupied, or at least peacefully occupied, a wide range of different countries. Obviously, we know about Germany and Japan, as Jerry just mentioned, as well as Korea. But the truth is that it has also occupied Australia. Australia was a friendly invasion, so to speak, surreptitious in nature, but very comprehensive in its execution. The US today controls or influences Australia's intelligence community, its defense capabilities, its economy, and much of its industry as well. There are even some people, and there will be links to this in the description, who believe that the US controls the government. Whatever decision Australia makes will be made in consultation, cooperation, or perhaps even with the permission of the United States government. Just think about those nuclear submarines from France that they lost billions just because they demanded that the Americans were to be purchased. It is apparent that the US has already achieved what it wants to achieve in Australia. There is almost 100% misinformed media narrative about China in the country, creating thus a sense in Australia that China is a threat militarily, industrially, economically, and even at a local level with stories that the Chinese are buying all the houses and they're the ones driving real estate prices out of the reach of locals, stuff like this. Effectively, to use a mafia analogy, the USA has created a fear of some danger and is now offering protection from that danger, not just for a fee, but actually for total submission to the United States. That is a sad state of affairs. It is now virtually impossible for Australia to extricate itself from the control of the USA. In Japan, just like the USA, the infrastructure is falling apart. And now the Japanese government has called for US companies to in fixing that situation, something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. Now, when we consider Korea, the United States completely controls the military through what is called the Combined Forces Command. As John Mearsheimer, which we will probably leave the link to the video in the description, he succinctly pointed out at a Center for Independent Studies 4 years ago. That link will take you to about minute 26 and 50 seconds. He says that you cannot choose to be China and America's friend at the same time. You can only choose one or the other. He went on to say, you do not want to be America's enemy. Ask Fidel Castro. And everybody laughed and clapped in that room. Think of the subservience of that gesture. Any country that sides with China, in other words, will become the enemy of America. And that's the truth.
I never knew there was such a thing as a friendly invasion. Very interesting. So when you put it that way, it really sounds as though certain countries are simply coerced to be friends with America, whereas perhaps their real strategic interests might lie elsewhere, even with China. And you just quoted Professor Mearsheimer, as he said, you cannot possibly be friends with both. At least that would be an exceedingly difficult tightrope to walk, I think. Jerry, if I could bring you back in. So in what ways does the US bring pressure to bear on other countries to comply and fall into line? What sort of tools does it have at its disposal?
Well, it's worth remembering that one of the biggest threats in this region in particular is not China. It comes from US ownership, control of, or influence over many, and some would say perhaps even most large companies, including the big four banks in any country that you can imagine. Many of the most important mining and resource companies as well. So what American interests could do to a country that isn't compliant to the US or to the US interests is actually beyond the comprehension of most people. Now, let's take, for example, Australia, which is where I know better. Australia may believe it has the right to choose how it deals with China. The obvious choice is the most simple one: rely on China for trade and the USA for security. But of course, that's not so simple. China and Australia are in a bilateral relationship, but Australia and China have this third party, so it's a trilateral relationship with the USA. In other words, China would be happy to provide Australia with that choice as long as the security measures don't pose a threat to them. Now, AUKUS poses a threat, but not an immediate threat to China, and can therefore be pretty much discounted from today's discussion. Now, this might change in 10 or 15 years, but an AUKUS conclusion is very unlikely, because by the time that comes to any conclusion, there would have been several changes of government and therefore changes of policy. So whatever AUKUS is today will not be what it is after November. And quite assuredly, no matter which president wins the next term, it will not be the same after the 2028 election. It's already known that Australia won't have taken delivery of any submarines by then. So while China might be happy to allow the choice, the US lives by a different code and most likely wouldn't. Wang Yi was in Australia last month, aiming to reset the trade issues that the two countries had. And this gives Australia a choice right now between improving relationships and increasing trade with China, or having the USA as a security partner. And as Penny Wong, the Foreign Affairs Minister, calls the USA our closest ally and principal strategic partner. So for China, a multipolar world is possible. For the USA, as many commentators have already pointed out, it's absolutely not possible. So the words of Mearsheimer, the USA will not accept a peer competitor in this region. The US is smearing China through media misinformation right now on the internet. It's hacking this hacking thing through this narrative of China's threatening or aggression on the Philippines and Taiwan, all of which we know, if we just do a modicum of research, are not true. Did you know that in China, a female employee who gives birth is entitled to 158 days of fully paid maternity leave, starting 15 days before the due date of birth? If multiple births, twins, triplets, etc., an additional 15 days of leave is allowed per baby. If a female employee miscarries in the first 4 months of pregnancy, she's entitled to 15 days of paid leave, and after the first 4 months, 42 days of paid leave. There is no national regulation for paternity leave, but regionally, each place can make its own rules. Beijing allows 15 days, Shanghai allows 10 days. Now you know.
So China seems certainly to be in favor of bilateral partnerships, but is being undermined by the USA. It's also surprising that Australia, is a relatively large modern country, and the US can already exert such an influence over it. I shudder to think what the US can do and does do, presumably, to force smaller or weaker countries to comply. Fernando, how might it do that?
Well, that is actually a very difficult question to answer, Ian, because it depends on how evil we think the USA can actually be. Remember that this is a country that was born from a colony, the genocide of natives and slavery of Africans, with absolutely no respect for the rule of law, and one that has been at war for almost its entire history, with several of those having started by proven lies. And perhaps the worst part about all this is the lack of accountability by the world. It is a country which has the highest degree of incarceration of its own people, and which allows its citizens the right to shoot at each other. This simply cannot be, in any normal world, considered a benevolent country. It might sound laughable, but given its history, if it doesn't get its own way, the US could instigate a war with any of these countries. It already has troops and materials on the ground to do so in each of the countries that we've talked about, in Korea, in Japan, in Australia, the UK, and Germany. So I understand that this view might sound extreme to some people, but not beyond the realm of what's possible. The real military threat is not one of invasion, but more likely one of abandonment. Each of these countries relies on the USA for several things. Australia, for example, depends heavily on the US for regional security, as does Germany. Now, imagine the risk of the US simply just pulling out all of its military support and just walking away and leaving these countries alone. Many people might suggest that this is a great idea, but the governments see such a high risk in China or Russia, for example, that I simply cannot accept such a move. The risk is false, of course. It has been created with the view to selling weapons and is, as the mafia analogy describes it, and written about by Charles Tilley, a protection racket. We do need to remember that Australia has a deep-seated fear of China. This has been, what should I say, imposed on them by American influence in their media, through their politicians, and through hundreds of think tank reports. China is simply considered to be evil. If the US were to threaten to pull out all military support, Australia and Germany would psychologically at least feel that they were about to be overrun by China. In the case of Australia, it almost happened by the Japanese, and in Germany, they have had experienced it already. Neither of these countries will be capable of capable of defending itself against an immediate threat. But in Australia's case, it gets even worse. Some people view Indonesia as a threat too, and the view is once again perpetuated by institutions like ASPI. This appears to be a deliberate tactic designed to create a need to have the USA on the same side. The Australia Strategic Policy Institute, the ASPI that I just mentioned, also has many articles on the growing and strengthening relationship with India. It would be a foregone conclusion that if the USA were no longer a member of the Quad, that these positives would turn into negatives, and without US protection, India would become a threat to Australia. Exactly the same situation applies to Japan. And once again, ASPI writes glowingly of the relationship between Australia and Japan. The US would be keen to point out that choosing China over America would create a rift in the Quad and would be folly for Australia to throw away these opportunities. In other words, as we've said it before, if you are in with us, we're going to make sure that those other countries aren't with you either. I suspect that the Philippines are feeling the same way these days. It's in the process of upsetting several neighbors, including Malaysia, which is not mentioned very often. But the PM of Malaysia is currently helping the Philippines to negotiate between Muslim separatists in the southern region, as well as dealing with all these South China Sea issues without any outside interference. So that's something important to consider, Ian.
So, Jerry, militarily, this is a serious problem for many, many countries, not just the few that are occupied by the USA.
Yeah, that's true, Ian. But if we were to realize that there was no threat from China and really no threat from Russia if people did what they said they were going to do and they were not interested in escalation, then we could actually discount those military threats. If the USA did pull out of the region, a great many people would be nervous, but after nothing serious happened, they would be grateful and see what the US had been doing for the last few decades, that is, stoking fears to sell weapons. The real threat I see lies not militarily, but with financial concerns. If the USA feels there is an undue threat from a near peer competitor gaining ground in an allied country, it may decide to invoke something which most people have never even heard of, and that is the investor state dispute settlement. And what that does is it's a clause which gives international investors from America only the right to sue host countries. And this can be done if the host country legislates or changes legislation, even when it's in the public interest. And that could damage the profit making capabilities of the investor. So the costs of these lawsuits could literally run into billions. US corporations have invested heavily in all these countries, and this is one of the protections that they have on their investments, is to use this ISDS. If any one of them change laws, perhaps even sign a BRI memorandum, Belt and Road Industry, then the US could invoke these protections. So financially, the United States has very deep tentacles into all of these countries. And I have linked all this stuff, and I will do into the description. Investments in Australia totaled $984 billion. That's well over 1 trillion in Australian dollars, which is approximately half their GDP. But the US could just do something as easy as pull their investments out of Australia, and that would literally crash their economy. The US is significantly in debt. It may have neglected its own infrastructure. It may be sitting back and watching as its own people slip from affluence into poverty, which is actually happening right now in real time. And some regions have poverty levels in America as high as 40%. The overall level in the country right now of poverty is 12.4%. And despite this, they're still worried about things. The US owns significant and controlling interests in banking, retail, agriculture, communications. It has deep connections to Australia's defence, and there are huge investments in the Australian Stock Exchange too. Therefore, should the US decide to do so and simply pull out its investments, they can literally shut the host country down. They can do the same in Japan and Korea. And if we're going to be honest, it's likely that the CIA almost certainly has some, let's call it, background on many people in international politics. It's not beyond the realms of possibility that some coercion will be brought to bear on any politician or decision maker to follow a path that benefits the USA more than it benefits his or her own country. Remember the Marcos family? They robbed and ruled the Philippines, all with US approval and compliance. I can't remember a single call for them to be removed because they were dictators, even accused of murdering their opposition at one stage. It was very convenient for the US, who needed military bases for their wars in Asia. The Marcos family fled the Philippines. They took with them lots of the country's money. And this is something that the New York Times has reported on very, very fully. They fled to US-controlled Guam and from there settled in Hawaii. So this is just an opinion now because it's impossible to prove, but it's also hard to believe there isn't some covert influence there. After having fled in panic due to their mass corruption, Mrs. Marcos is back living in luxury in the Philippines with apparent immunity after avoiding several lawsuits, which they're now saying because of her advanced age. Their rehabilitation through US-pushed narratives is so good that their corrupt son is now the president of the Philippines. They could do that anywhere.
Well, hearing what you said in that last paragraph really does make it difficult to believe that they don't have any backing somewhere along the way from one party or another, hey?
Did you know that in February 2023, China released a concept paper calling for, among other things, the restructuring of the United Nations, the advancement of peace under a multipolar world order? The Global Security Initiative calls to eliminate the root causes of international conflict, improve global security governance, encourage joint international efforts to bring more stability and certainty to a volatile and changing era, and of course, to promote durable peace and development in the world. If anyone thinks that China is aggressive, they should really read this and look at what China has done. And now, you know.
So to recap, then, what America could do is one, all, or perhaps a combination of invading, suing the government, removing military protection, withdrawing all or part of its investments, or it could possibly, potentially control the votes of some politicians through either coercion and or media manipulation, let's say. So in short, any country not complying with US requests could be entirely crippled financially or vulnerable militarily. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, that's fair.
Yes, sir. That's the sad truth.
Oh dear. And on that rather shocking and depressing note, I'd like to thank you both for your thoughts and opinions on US hegemony. I look forward, of course, to our next discussion, and thank you out there for watching too. Please feel free to comment, to press the like button, to share, and above all, to subscribe to our channel. And we shall see you next time for more China insights on the 3Ms.
Bye for now.
Bye-bye.